Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to dive into our cybersecurity awareness webinar today. This is practical knowledge for a dangerous world. We've got a good list of attendees. We may have a few more people jumping in as we dive into this, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you very much. Bill, can you confirm for me that we're recording? Thank you. All right. Let's start off.
I'm getting a report that we're having issues hearing you. Just a moment. Oh, okay. Never mind. Now they can hear you. Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. Thank you. All right, let's dive in with some scary statistics. That's a great way to start off a Tuesday. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the cyber world, cyber landscape. Cyber attacks and data breaches have increased 15% from 2020 to 2021. That's probably not a surprise to most of you. We hear about this in the news on a very frequent basis, but those are the real numbers. That's a dramatic increase. We have a 62% year-over-year increase in ransomware complaints. This was reported to the FBI. This is just reports as opposed to actual investigated incidents. It's likely that the numbers are actually much higher than this because we know that many ransomware events are not actually reported to the FBI. So a big increase in ransomware complaints. Cyber criminals can penetrate up to 93% of company networks. That's the result of a pen test study done by Positive Technologies. That's not surprising to me. If you throw enough effort and time at a network, it's likely that you can find some way in. And only 50% of small and medium-sized businesses have a cybersecurity plan in place. That's an alarmingly low number. I think a lot of small and medium-sized businesses assume that they haven't been hit so far, so what they're doing is probably good enough, and they just don't take the time to put a plan in place. And we know that $43 billion has been lost through business email compromise attacks since 2016. That's a staggering number. It can get lost sometimes when we see the numbers of billions of dollars. That's roughly what Elon paid for Twitter. So, you know, in that respect, it may not be a lot of money, but to the average small and medium-sized business, that $43 billion is a staggering amount. And the median transaction size for a business email compromise is $60,000. So again, with the median, we're taking into account the very large events that are sometimes multiple millions of dollars and small events that can be as small as $1,000, $1,500. The median is $60,000. The Verizon data breach report, investigation report, shows us that the types of breaches that we're seeing over time are changing. You'll notice in this graph that web application attacks are actually declining, as are social engineering attacks. But what we see is that system intrusion is increasing pretty dramatically. I think what we're seeing here is a reaction by criminals to the different types of controls and training that businesses are putting into effect. So perhaps businesses are doing a better job educating their people about the risks of social engineering, and perhaps web developers are tightening up controls around their platforms, which makes it harder for criminals to get in. But we know that every time we tighten in one place, criminals go somewhere else to try and achieve their objective of hacking into organizations and somehow getting money out of those organizations. So the news is bad here on the whole, still increasing pretty dramatically. Ransomware is where this really stands out. Ransomware has increased 13% in the last year, and this rise is as big as the 5 prior years combined. So a very dramatic increase in ransomware risk. Ransomware now accounts for 25% of breaches in total. I think it's pretty clear to understand, or it's pretty easy to understand why that's the case. It's because it's a very profitable type of attack for criminals. It's a good way to extort businesses and get money from them. Let's look at some additional information from the Verizon 2022 data breach investigation report. These are attack vectors or action vectors and action varieties. We don't need to get into the weeds too much on the difference between vectors and varieties, but the Verizon breach report is available to anyone who would like to review it. It's an interesting report to some people, And there's lots of very technical definitions around cybercrime and cyber statistics. What I would ask you to pay attention to here is that social engineering and hacking and malware and social and phishing and use of stolen credentials are significant components of how threat actors are getting into environments. Pretexting is the act of a cyber criminal using a story to convince an individual or a group to do something they wouldn't normally do. I think most of us understand what phishing is, and we're certainly going to go into that in some greater detail here. So these are absolutely the most prevalent types of attacks that we see. Web application and email are the top two vectors in breaches. And of the 180 different types of varieties, 73% of breaches involve the top 10 varieties. So overwhelmingly, it's the use of stolen credentials, ransomware, phishing, that are the most successful for criminals. Other is a big category. It often includes one of these components, but then sometimes some other methods, and sometimes just combining the components. It's important to note too that 82% of breaches in the last year involved a human element. So this isn't just weaknesses in systems. This is oftentimes a person involved. And when that person is involved, it's typically because there was a phishing incident involved, stolen credentials, misuse, or just simple human error that allowed criminals into organizations. So people are still a very significant component of the risk that we're dealing with here. Of social engineering attacks, the most prevalent is phishing. So you'll see businesses, and we are going to talk a lot today about email platforms and security around email platforms. And that's because it is the most prevalent, most successful type of attack that we're seeing. And so you want to address the biggest weaknesses first. This graph shows the response time to incidents. And I know in the past you've heard that sometimes a threat actor will lurk for many, many days inside an organization before the organization becomes aware of it. So what this graph shows us is that there's a decline in attacks where it is months or more that go by before the threat actor is detected. And in fact, there is an increase in the number of attacks where the threat actor is discovered in days or less. So that sounds like good news. Unfortunately, actors are primarily involved, are the ones that are most often in kind of disclosing or making themselves known to the victims at this point. So what this actually says in some cases is that the threat actors are becoming more efficient. They get into an organization fast, they find out what they need fast, they perpetrate their crime, and then they contact the victim and say, hey, you've been hacked. Now let's get on to the financial portion of this transaction and have you pay us money. So it's actually not good that the time to find the threat actors is declining, because the threat actors are the one disclosing now that they're inside. Some of the common attack vectors, and we've already mentioned social engineering for sure, spoofing, which is the act of sending an email to a victim and making it look as though it came from someone inside the organization. It takes several different forms, but typically done via email. Malware, which is just software that has malicious intent. Man-in-the-middle attacks, this is where a threat actor inserts themselves into a conversation, into the transfer of data, and they can manipulate that data or that conversation to their advantage. Denial of service attacks are when a threat actor tries to bring down a website or bring down a company's network, and they do that for the purpose of creating chaos, which often introduces opportunity. Web application attacks are very common. So anytime there's a vulnerability in a website, a web application, a commerce site, threat actors can take advantage of that. Ransomware, we mentioned, is probably the most significant risk for small businesses. And we know that significant change creates significant opportunity for criminals. So as businesses are evolving and maturing and having more remote workers, and there's a lot of M&A activity and businesses are combining, or there's new go-to-market strategies, or people are changing software platforms, anytime a business is going through rapid change, it creates opportunities for criminals because things are new and people do things that they might not do if they were kind of settled in their ways and had an established procedure. So hopefully, taking a look at those stats, we can agree that cybercrime is on the rise. It has been on the rise for a very long period of time. Most users' knowledge and most business controls are still relatively low. This is particularly true with the small and mid-market sectors. And we know that threat actors operate just above where most of the controls are. So threat actors maybe don't spend a lot of effort learning how to hack firewalls. In fact, we see firewall hacking declining in terms of that being an attack vector. It's not entirely gone, but it's relatively low because it requires a lot of knowledge and a lot of effort. So we see threat actors really going at the most opportunistic platforms, such as phishing and gaining access to someone's email, or getting into an environment for the purpose of encrypting files. And they're operating just above where most of the controls are. So what we need to do is we need to rise above and make sure that our knowledge and our controls are just above where most of those threat actors are playing. And we can, by doing that, we can eliminate a very significant amount of risk for ourselves and the organizations that we work for. So how do we get there? How do we protect ourselves from the criminals and prevent ourselves from falling victim to those most common types of attack? First, we need to decrease our attack surface. So this really means that we want to pay attention to all those ever-expanding IT platforms that businesses use and make sure that we don't have data sitting in places that are easy for criminals to attack. Oftentimes, this will mean consolidating where we store data, certainly decommissioning old platforms that might give a threat actor access to data, and then shrinking the methods that the threat actors can use to get into environments. So decrease or shrink your attack surface. We want to implement, this is at a business level, we want to implement and routinely review our cybersecurity policies and controls. If you're involved in obtaining cyber insurance for a small business, you know that requirements there have increased pretty dramatically, and constantly reviewing how you're addressing the cyber threat is very important. Then we want to approach security in layers, and this is a very common theme that's been talked about for many, many years. We think that you want to focus on email, so email security. We also want to look at where your data is stored and make sure that you've got good security controls around the data. And when businesses really start looking at this and individuals start looking at where their data is stored, they're often surprised at the number of different places where valuable data is stored. So this involves sitting down, kind of sketching out where your data lives and figuring out what you're doing to protect it. And then applications and systems, so software as a service applications, servers, whether they live in a closet in your business or whether they live in the cloud, really making sure that those systems and applications are protected. And then the networks that we use to connect to our email, our data, our applications, and our systems. Those are the layers that we want to do. Then last, and certainly not least, and what we're going to focus on today is the human element. And we want to make sure that our people are constantly aware of the threat, they understand the nature of the threat, and they know what they can do to protect a business from the threat. So let's start first with passwords. I know it can be a little bit boring. You're going to see some things that you've seen before, but I want you to all understand the nature of the threat as it relates to passwords these days. So this is a list of recent breaches. This is well publicized. We're not calling out any particular business here. This list is much longer, but this is a list of some recent breaches. What happens when there's a breach is that criminals will take that information and put it out to market on the dark web. So they'll take usernames, passwords, social security numbers, dates of birth, all the things that we might think are that need to be protected, so that because they could give a threat actor access to an environment, they then put that up for sale on the dark web. We also know that there are a list of passwords that constantly get reused. I have listed the top 10 passwords for 2022, and this shows why we have to keep talking about passwords, because somebody out there is still using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as a password, or QWERTY or password. This list is huge. There is a readily available list of the top 1 million passwords that are used, And I think it's highly predictable that all of us have a couple of passwords that are in that list. So that list also goes into the dark web, into what we call a dictionary or a database of passwords. Then the threat actor organization pulls in information from both of those sources, leaked credentials and those dictionary attacks. And they use that to attempt to gain access to accounts. Now, they might do this on a targeted basis. They might do this for an individual's bank account, or they might just spray these credentials all over the place and try to get access to wherever they can. They'll just keep trying these lists of credentials or known passwords over and over and over until they hit a website and they're successful. Once they're successful, they've opened the door to the organization, and now they can start to figure out how they can perpetrate a real crime here. So this is why we have to keep talking about passwords. When it comes to passwords, we want to make sure that they're unique. The importance of the passwords being unique is that if one is accidentally divulged through a hack, or if it happens to be on that long list of known passwords, at least the criminal may only be able to get into one place rather than being able to access lots of different places. The number of people that have told me they have a very complex password that they can remember and they use it in lots of different places, that used to be a tactic. It is not a good tactic any longer, because if a criminal gets that password that's used in lots of places, they can simply try it over and over and over again until they strike it rich. So it needs to be unique. Also needs to have lots of random characters. The more random characters, the better. This doesn't mean that we have to use special characters, but it does mean that the more random, the better, so that a dictionary attack that might use every word in the dictionary as a potential password, or every word in the dictionary with a 1 added to the end, or every word in the dictionary with a exclamation mark added to the end. When we throw in random characters, it helps prevent the vulnerability of a password in a dictionary attack. And then, unfortunately, it's really important that passwords be strong. 12 to 26 characters is optimal. The more important the data, the longer it should be. And this is because the compute horsepower that can be thrown at cracking passwords, just trying all the possible passwords over and over, the efficacy of that horsepower, that compute power, diminishes, almost gets impossible the closer we get to 26 characters. So unfortunately, longer is better. One of the most important things you can do is store your passwords in an encrypted password manager. Trust me, the threat actors know all of the places that people have thought are clever places to store credentials: sticky notes, password protected Word documents, password protected Excel spreadsheets, in a contact form, something like that. Password managers really are the way to go. And then don't let your browsers remember passwords. I think this one's particularly important because if a criminal gets into your system as you, they can open up a browser and then they get access to all the platforms where your browser has remembered those credentials. So it's pretty easy to go into your browser and say, don't remember my passwords, don't prompt to remember my passwords. Instead, use that password manager to store your credentials. Next, multi-factor authentication. I know most of you have heard this many, many times, but we're going to reiterate this again here. These are all the places where it's really important to have multi-factor authentication. Email. If you personally and your business don't have multi-factor authentication set up on email, you need to stop, drop, and roll and get this done ASAP. The other place you want to make sure and have multi-factor authentication set up is on your password manager. So if you're going to put all of your credentials, your unique, random, long credentials into your password manager, you want to make sure that that's protected with multi-factor authentication. Also, make sure your cellular carrier account is protected with MFA. Our cell phones are the key to lots of different places that we go online these days. You probably have your password manager running on your phone. You may have MFA set up to text you on your phone. So protecting that cellular account, your T-Mobile, your Verizon, your AT&T accounts, that's really important. Any remote access platform, VPN, go to my PC, log me in, remote desktop, virtual desktop, all of those need to be protected with multi-factor. And that's a very common threat target for criminals. Admin accounts. It's a really good idea to not be an administrator on your computer and to have a separate admin account. Oftentimes the business that you're working with or for will manage this separately for you. So it's not something that an individual might do, but having a separate admin account is great, and you need multi-factor on those admin accounts. Website hosts. You do not want a threat actor to get control of your website. They can wreak havoc for you. Lots of reputational risk, perhaps even if you've got a web store or if there's sensitive data that can be accessed through your website. Think about your web hosts. Oftentimes, this is turned over to web developers. Make sure your web developers are using multi-factor authentication for their access to your web host. Cloud storage, so OneDrive, iCloud, Dropbox, Box, Google, wherever you're storing documents online as a business or individually, make sure you have multi-factor authentication set up. Security cameras and DVR appliances. You do not want threat actors getting into your security systems and looking at what's happening in your offices or at your home and using that information to access or extort money from a business. Social media accounts. So these are a very common attack vector for criminals. Make sure you have those protected with multi-factor authentication. Losing access to your social media accounts can be a very big deal. Registrars. So this is where you register your domain names. So places like Network Solutions and GoDaddy. Really important that those accounts are protected. That is the key to your online identity if you're a business. So make sure you're protecting those registrar accounts and website hosts, obviously. There are some people that are attending today and doing this as part of an annual cyber training requirement. If you are one of those people, please make note of this training code. Your employer may ask for it afterwards. We'll have another training code at the end of the presentation here. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a phishing, social engineering attack, and business email compromise. So that attack starts with a threat actor sending an email to a victim. That victim clicks on a link or follows the instructions of that email, and they go to a phishing website. And at that phishing website, they enter in credentials. So this might be Microsoft 365, it could be Google, it could be Dropbox, it could be Salesforce, whatever the attacker is trying to get access to. When the victim enters their credentials in, the credentials actually go to the threat actor. Then that threat actor tries to use those credentials to log into a legitimate website. And that's how a business email compromise happens if the threat actor is trying to collect your email credentials. Once the threat actor is inside your email, they can go all different places throughout your organization. They can find someone else in the organization who has access to banking information. They can insert themselves in the payables conversation and change invoice amounts or change where invoices are sent or where payments are directed. And criminals are very adept at doing this. This is where I want to emphasize the importance of multi-factor. If a criminal gains access to your credentials, but you have multi-factor enabled, you're going to get an alert on your mobile device. Might come to text, might come to an app. App is a better approach here. And if you weren't logging in to that site at that time, if you weren't going to Microsoft 365 for email, for example, or if you weren't actively logging into Salesforce and all of a sudden you see your MFA prompt for Salesforce come up, that's where you should stop and question what's happening here. And you should deny access. If you aren't the one trying to log in, you should deny access. That will stop the threat actor. They won't be able to access the website. That's why multi-factor is so very important. When we talk about phishing, there's a couple of different ways that threat actors go about their phishing attacks. First, very broad approaches. This is the type of a fishing boat that drags these nets kind of along the bottom of the ocean, and they collect lots of different types of people or fish and types of organisms. That's the same thing that happens with threat actors. They'll just spray out social engineering and phishing attacks and see who bites, and then they'll go about trying to figure out how they might leverage that particular individual's weakness. But we also have phishing attacks that are much more targeted, so spear phishing attacks. And I want you to understand how easy it is for criminals to do this. We all divulge a lot of information online. I do this. I've got a LinkedIn page. There's information out there about me that a threat actor might absolutely use. So I'm going to pick on Tom Heenick, the president of Go West IT, a little bit. This is Tom's LinkedIn page. On his LinkedIn page, I can see that he went to the University of Colorado. I can also see that he's just recently been named president of Go West IT. And if I dig a little deeper into his LinkedIn page, I can find out that Tom is on the board. He's actually the board chair for an organization that he's very close to. He spends a lot of time working on it. So if I was a threat actor, I might be able to take this information and craft a social engineering attack, a phishing attack on Tom, and it would be a spear phishing attack. And that might look something like this. Tom, congratulations on your promotion to president of Go West IT. With this achievement, and because of your commitment to community by serving on the board of Friends of Broomfield, the University of Colorado President's Club would like to honor you as a 2020 inductee. Will you please join us along with your peers for an evening of recognition and celebration? Please click here for more information and to register for the event. Now, if Tom wasn't really hyper suspicious, this is the kind of thing that I think a lot of people might fall for. And if he were to follow that link, he could be fed into something that says, use your Microsoft 365 credentials or your LinkedIn credentials to register for this event. And then the criminal gets those credentials. So this is how easy it is for someone to target someone with social engineering. They can get much more clever than this. I will tell you that social engineering and phishing attacks that have to do with free Chick-fil-A coupons are very easy for people to fall victim for. People love Chick-fil-A and they'll click on almost anything to get a free Chick-fil-A sandwich. So it can be broad or it can be very targeted, and you need to be hyper vigilant when you're looking out for these things. So to prevent and recognize a social engineering attack, which can be a phishing attack, which is via email, phishing, which is via voice. It might happen in person, someone stopping by your office and asking for information or soliciting information. They might even come in with a story, and it can happen in your browser as well. To recognize a social engineering attack, first, be aware of urgency. Any pressure to act quickly or else something bad will happen is an indication that this might be a social engineering attack. And the reason that tactic is used is that criminals know that people do stupid things when they don't stop and slow down. Second is a lack of context or pertinent details. So if something just doesn't make sense, that's when you need to stop and ask questions. Unusual dates and times, or an unusual sender or an unusual request should raise your level of suspicion. An unsolicited promise of gain or benefit. So, I know most of you probably won't give your personal banking information to the Saudi prince who's looking to move a couple $1 million around just for safekeeping, but be aware of those free Chick-fil-A sandwiches. Those will get you just as easy as the Saudi prince and the millions of dollars will. So to prevent a social engineering attack, first just slow down a little bit. I know that we've got a lot of customer service people that part of their job is responding quickly in the business world that we live in. Give yourself a few extra seconds to look at emails, to think about what's being asked of you over the phone, to think about what you're seeing in text messages. Just slow down a little bit. Ask yourself, why am I being asked this, and what is at stake? What is potentially at risk if I respond to this the way that I'm being asked to? Then seek independent verification. If you become a little bit suspicious, who can you ask, hey, is this legitimate? In that example that I showed with Tom Heenick, and if he were to receive that email, he could probably contact the University of Colorado Alumni Association and say, hey, I received an email about being inducted into the President's Club. Is that a real thing? Can you tell me a little bit more about that, before he clicks on that link and enters in his credentials? Just increasing awareness between colleagues, talking internally in your business about, when you see something that's a little peculiar, or maybe something that you saw someone else fall victim to, just increasing awareness will help prevent social engineering attacks. Make it comfortable to raise questions and concerns in your organization, and continue to educate people throughout your organization. Developing a security first mentality is crucial, because paranoia is not retroactive. So that little voice that you hear that says this could be something wrong, there could be something fishy here, pay attention to that. Let's talk a little bit about browsing security. So this is when you're using Chrome, Edge, whatever browser you use, Firefox. Browsers can be an easy way for criminals to get malware into environments, and that happens through a lot of different methods. Malware is absolutely distributed via ads, so be careful about ads that pop up in your social media feeds. When you're browsing on Google, ads that are off to the side could lead you to a site that have malware in them. So be very cautious of that. Always be cautious when using links to websites. When in doubt, go directly to the site rather than clicking on a link that someone else provided. Be suspicious when accessing websites via a QR code. We've all become very comfortable at scanning a QR code to look at a menu in a restaurant. And I think that's a reality that we have to deal with now. But I would tell you, if you don't feel confident that you're getting the QR code from a verified source, don't just scan QR codes and click on them to see what's behind that QR code. Pretty easy for a threat actor to stick up a poster on the wall and that says, sign up for a free demo of a piece of software or something. Just click on this QR code. Perhaps that QR code's taking you somewhere that has some malicious code behind it. Don't download software files from untrusted sources, and always check with your employer before installing any software. We see a lot of malware distributed through free fonts, free plugins, drivers, free software. Really be cautious of what you're downloading and installing on your computer. Optimally, you won't have admin rights to install that on your computers, but just really be careful about it and make sure to check to see if it's okay. Free fonts, free driver software, really dangerous in this regard. Don't circumvent controls by your employer. If you run into a roadblock and can't get somewhere or can't download something, that roadblock is there for your safety. Ask. If you really need to get somewhere, say, hey, I'm trying to get to this particular site because I need this particular piece of software. Can you open it up for me? And your employer can contact the IT department. If they're working with Go West IT, we can open that link up if we're asked to do so and give you access to a legitimate place online that you need to get to. So if you don't try to work around it by downloading it and copying it onto USB and moving it over to your work computer, when you hit a roadblock, stop. Look for, but don't rely on the HTTPS padlock. So we all used to be very, very cognizant of the padlock in the browser window, and that would tell us that that site was encrypted, or at least the traffic to that site was encrypted. Unfortunately, now all a criminal has to do is buy an SSL certificate and put that on a site that they're using to propagate malware. And so a criminal, a bad site may have a lock on it. That doesn't mean that it's safe. That just means that the traffic between you and that website is encrypted. But if the criminal owns that website and controls what's on the site, you've just securely gone to a very malicious site. So watch out for those sites, regardless of whether or not they have a padlock. Then pay attention to the domain names. So this link looks like it's going to Google, but if I mouse over this link would actually take me to a website called haveibeenpwned.com. That happens to be a website where you can enter in your email address and find out if your email address has been compromised in any known breaches. And so this link to Google doesn't actually go to Google, it goes to a completely different site. So hold your mouse over the link to see where it's actually taking you. And if it's someplace that you don't expect, you need to stop. Let's talk a little bit about remote work security. So a lot of us are working from home these days or working remotely. Not everybody, but some of us are. And I think the first thing you want to do is acknowledge that business devices are for business purposes. It is possible that your employer says, "Yep, no problem. Use your business device for personal use as well." And if that's the company's policy, then that's their right to do that. But I would tell you, as an individual, you want to be hyper vigilant about what you're doing personally with that business device. In general, I would tell you leave business devices for business purposes and do your own personal life computing on your own personal device. You don't want to be the one that introduces a breach to your organization because you tripped across something bad while you were doing some personal browsing. Next, lock your machines when you step away. I would tell you this is just as important in your personal residence as it is in a coffee shop or certainly an airport or any other public space. Just be in the habit of always locking your machine. And the easiest way to lock your machine is just Windows L, key to lock a Windows device. Just make sure you lock it, and always be prompted for a password when you log in. Hopefully that's managed by your business. Be aware of the line of sight to your computer. Very common tactic for threat actors to lurk in coffee shops or airports and look over people's shoulders to see where they're going and what they're doing. And this is a way that when you use public Wi-Fi, I think that's the next one on here. Yeah, when you're using public Wi-Fi, if someone is sitting behind you and sees where you're going and they're on the same public Wi-Fi network, particularly if it's not encrypted, they may be able to sniff the traffic that you're sending to that site and pick up your passwords and or any information you're downloading. So never use public Wi-Fi. I know this is tough. And there was a period of time when we used to say, be careful, try to limit your use of public Wi-Fi. I would go so far now as to say, just don't use public Wi-Fi. If you have to be out and around and using Wi-Fi, look into using your cellular service as a hotspot and just avoid public unprotected networks altogether. Lock down your home network. Okay, so this involves first making sure that the admin password for your home Wi-Fi router. So this is going to be sometimes the ISP's router, so Comcast or CenturyLink. Making sure that the admin password there is not set to whatever the default was. You need to log into it, choose something complex that only you know, because the criminals have a list of all those default passwords. So if you purchased your own Wi-Fi router, a Linksys, Netgear, make sure that you've changed the default password on that home router. Next, check to see if your home router has any firmware upgrades. Most modern routers now have a way to set it to automatically upgrade. That's optimal. If yours doesn't, you need to schedule a time to look at your firmware on a regular basis. The reason this is important is because criminals will take advantage of known vulnerabilities with particular Wi-Fi routers or home internet routers, and they can get into home networks if the firmware isn't updated to patch those vulnerabilities. So make sure you're patching your home router. It's optimal if you can separate your home, your personal network from your work network. So if you work from home, having a separate Wi-Fi SSID, a network that you can use just for work that doesn't communicate with your TV and your thermostat and your kids' gaming systems, that is optimal. And just keep that for work purposes. Don't share it out with your relatives. Don't share it out with your friends when they come over. Keep that network separate. Treat your office, your home office, just like your regular office. Make sure that your device is secured, locked up, put away. You'd hate to have a home break-in or someone that you didn't know was in your house that grabbed something and took off with it, and that becomes a big problem, particularly if a machine is not encrypted. If someone were to steal a laptop and it wasn't encrypted, that's a huge issue. So I'm going to stop here and see if we have any questions. I think Phil has been monitoring the Q&A. I don't know that we have anything in there yet. Phil, will you chime in and tell me if you have any questions at the moment?
Nothing so far. There's a slight delay, so we might want to give people a few seconds to enter any questions into the Q&A section.
Okay. Please feel free to ask any questions you'd like. We're right at 40 minutes, and I promised that we'd keep this under 45, so we're doing good here. Can't see who all attended the webinar today. We have a pretty good group of attendees. Okay, the last training code is firewall. So the first training code was human, the last is firewall. We want you all to be a human firewall. You're still welcome to add questions here. I do see one coming in. If I have a VPN on my phone, does that make public Wi-Fi safer? That is a great question. So what having a VPN does, whether it's on your phone or your laptop, is that it takes the traffic from your device to wherever you're going online, and it passes it through an encrypted tunnel. So if you're on public Wi-Fi and you're using a VPN, what you're doing between your computer and the site that you're going to passes through that VPN service. And so if someone else is lurking on the same Wi-Fi network, they can't necessarily watch all of that traffic. It does provide a level of protection, an additional layer of protection. I don't think it's 100% though, because if a criminal were able to get onto your machine, doesn't matter that you're encrypted, between your computer and wherever you're going on the internet, they still would be able to see that while they're on your machine. And so, if they were able to gain access to your machine before you connected to that VPN, the jig is up, and they'd be able to see all the traffic anyway. I think it does add a layer of protection, but it isn't a foolproof method. I think too, with all the different VPN services, you need to recognize that whoever's providing that VPN service, they can see all of your traffic as well. So there are very good reputable services that have kind of a zero trust model where they say they're not looking at it, but you can never really be 100% sure of that. My advice would be to stay off of public Wi-Fi if at all possible. Use your own access point, your own cellular device or hotspot for that. And on those cellular devices and hotspots, you want to set a complex code. You want to make sure that you're required to use a code when you connect to it. You don't want to give that out to other people around you. A lot of people's hotspots are named iPhone. So make sure that yours is an iPhone and it isn't open. Otherwise, you could allow someone next to you in a coffee shop to jump on your Wi-Fi. I hope I answered that question. Happy to expand on that. Bill, I'm gonna just keep going down the list here if that's okay. Looks like you're gonna send a link to the recording. If you had to tell people 2 or 3 things among the many things to implement, what would those be? First and foremost, multi-factor authentication on email and use a password manager. Those 2 things, and when I say use a password manager, I mean get a password manager, go through the original training and use it as it's intended to be used, and it will help change your passwords for you. It'll create long, complex passwords. It'll store those for you, and you want to use unique passwords everywhere you can. So multi-factor authentication and use a password manager. Is a fingerprint scanner secure for laptop and phones? A fingerprint scanner is a great way to make sure that it is actually you accessing the device, and I think in most cases it's as good or better than using a password. And you can also use Windows Hello, which does a scan of your face now, and facial recognition on iPhones and Androids is really the same thing as using a fingerprint at this point. It is something that you have because you have your thumb or you have your face, and that's different than something which is a username and password. So it is a good way to access devices. I think we're probably headed down the path of the fingerprint file being accessible by criminals at some point, and or Face IDs being accessible by criminals and somehow being able to backward engineer that. I don't want you to think that that's actually happening now. I'm not aware of any cases where it's happening. I was at an event last week though, and there was a lot of discussion about cybersecurity, and there was some talk about the security of the databases that store those files. So I do think it's a good way to access devices. And then the other one is it safe to use a VPN on public Wi-Fi? I think it's a little safer. I don't know that I'd call it 100% safe. Let's see if I covered all that. I think I've answered everything in the chat, and I am happy to stay and answer more questions. So please let me know if you have any other questions. Obviously, you can always contact GoWestIT. I'd be happy to visit with you about this individually. Obviously, if you're a customer, we can talk about this anytime. We can get you in touch with someone who can answer any questions you have, and happy to have those conversations at any point in time. So if there's no other questions, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the webinar today, just 1 minute over. I appreciate everybody attending. We are going to send out the recording to those who registered. Thanks very much. Stay safe out there. Have a great Thanksgiving.